Hello everybody, welcome to the next in the series of our anaphylaxis campaign webinars. Today our webinar is on managing your allergies in a new reality, and holding this webinar for us, I'm delighted to introduce Moira Howie. Moira is a very old friend of mine, and she was one of the first people I met when I joined the anaphylaxis campaign 12 years ago. Moira has done lots of things for us over the years. She's chaired conferences, spoken at conferences, she's done webinars, she's been a member of our corporate food panel, and she's been a very, very great supporter of us over the years. So big thank you to Moira for that, and a big thank you to her for doing the webinar today. I will tell you a little bit about Moira. She has a very impressive CV, so I'm going to cut it down a little bit. But she's worked in both the public and the private sectors. She's been a cardiology technician, for example, in the NHS. And she's also worked for health promotion departments. She's been part of global public relations companies, and she's done work for Unilever and Danone in that context. But the way that I know Moira is through her work with Waitrose, and she was with Waitrose for 17 years. Waitrose have been fantastic corporate members of the anaphylaxis campaign, and Moira has always advocated for us within that organisation. So we've been their Christmas charity, etc., etc. So very, very supportive. Moira has recently retired from Waitrose, and she's joined the non-executive board of Camden BRI, which is an independent scientific advisory organisation. And it's one, again, which the anaphylaxis campaign work with closely. So I'm looking forward to carrying on our connections with Moira. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Moira, who will give the presentation. Moira will address some of the issues that you've been raising with us within her presentation, but we've also had a very significant number of questions sent directly to us when people knew that this webinar was taking place. And you have the opportunity to submit questions during the presentation as well. As with all the other webinars, I'm absolutely sure we won't have time to work through all of the questions as they're submitted. So they will appear as a Q&A on our website. Also, it's great that so many of you are watching this webinar live today, but there will be an opportunity to watch it online via a link from our website after this webinar today. And also Moira's presentation will be available to corporate members. So without further ado, I will hand over to Moira.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you to the Anaphylaxis campaign for inviting me to do today's webinar. I'd also like to thank the wider team behind Lynn and me, who are making sure that all this runs smoothly for us. So I'm quite clear now that the technology will work. If it doesn't, it will probably be my fault. So I hope we have a great exchange over the next 40 minutes or so, and I hope that we can learn through this together. So the majority of my life has been spent in the food industry, as Lynn indicated, and I want to look at some of the inner workings around food production, and specifically today the impact on COVID and how that will continue to impact how we all live and work. And unfortunately now we are entering wave 2. I don't have all the answers, but we were going to ask you to post questions, as Lynn has said, and we'll do our best to make sure that we give you the best advice that we can do. And if we can't find it now, we'll find it later, as Lynn said. So I just want to share my screen now, and I'm going to just go through a few introductory slides before I start with the topic that we're going to look at today. So I'm just going to share my screen. So can you see that screen now?
Yes,
So
that's great.
I'd just like to start off with some statistics that are from the Food Standards Agency. Around 2 million people in the UK suffer with allergens. 5% of those are children and 2% are adults. So what we can see is that it disproportionately affects young people and children. So being young is a risk factor for allergens. If we look then at the deaths, on average, about 10 deaths a year are attributed to food allergy. That, of course, is 10 deaths too many, as we know that deaths are largely preventable with the right precautions set in place, and that's good information, and having your EpiPen with you. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, there is about 1 in 10 people who are estimated to have celiac disease, which in itself should not be a life-threatening condition. It is, of course, lifelong and causes great debility for people. About 3 or 4 years ago, we, together with the Food Standards Agency, launched a campaign called Easy to Ask. It's an important campaign because it's really directed at young people who we know tend to be eating out more on their own, and we want them to make sure that they are as safe as they possibly can be by making sure that they ask the right questions when they're ordering food and when they receive food at the table. This is increasingly important, and today, in today's environment where more and more people are actually having home deliveries, it will have greater emphasis. So do make sure that we're aware of hashtag easy to ask for any young people who are going out, and the details are there on the slide. The Food Standards Agency are committed to making sure that good allergy information is available. It's part of their work. And we know as hospitalities and retailers that good allergy information is good for business. We want to make sure that people come into stores or into eating out areas that they feel secure and safe to ask the questions and get the right information they need to make the right choices. This research came up with 5 key findings which were made available to the hospitality industry, and these key findings are shown here on this slide. They're very important, making sure that your staff are knowledgeable, that you invite customers to discuss what their allergy requirements are, and of course making sure that detailed information is available for people. These are clear to follow, and we must make sure that they are a part of being a good business. FSA met in September 16 to look at really where they were with research around food hypersensitivity, allergies and intolerance. And I'm pleased to say that they felt that the programme that was running was well managed and that had significant engagement. But I think it's clear to see now that they are committed to ensuring that the evidence and the research funding into allergies, food intolerance and hypersensitivity continues to receive the funding that it should. And this is really good news in today's environment where we see that often funding is cut. But of course it shows that the Food Standards Agency really do recognise the importance of the allergy population at large. So this is why you've all dialed in today, not to hear the background, but really to look at some of the things about COVID-19 and how it's affected food production. So that's what's going to be the focus. And I'm going to go through these 5 key questions, which we discussed some weeks ago now, and see if I can throw some light on that for you. The country lockdown was a shock to all of us, whatever your sphere of work, and these types of restrictions were totally new to all of us. For the food industry, this resulted in the closure of hospitality, restriction in retail settings where we were all queuing outside the supermarkets, and severe restrictions for agricultural workers too. Food production, transport and trade were all affected. And we all had to deal with global and local lockdowns, and we are still learning how to respond and deal with the new ways of working. There are a number of critical points which have directly affected food production and food manufacturing. And I want to divide these into three areas. One is looking at raw materials, so that's ingredient supply. The other is looking at people, and that's both the people that are responsible for producing food and us as people that are buying and shopping for the food, and then transportation. We all saw that some materials, raw materials, were in short supply in wave one, which was in April. This included flour, eggs, yeast, tinned tomatoes, tomato puree and dried pasta. That's just a short example, but those were the sorts of shortages that we saw on shelves in supermarkets when we were in wave one. These shortages were real and related to customers that were stocking up on products because they were worried about lockdown. And it's a natural response to building up if you think there's going to be a shortage. And we'd never experienced anything like this before. So it was a very real response to this emergency situation. At the peak of COVID in May, millions of pounds worth of non-perishable food items were in people's cupboards. People really went, I mean, people were shopping like it was Christmas and buying all those extra foods that they thought they might need because they really didn't know what was coming around the corner. And of course, these are still sitting in people's cupboards because they really feared that the worst was coming. They didn't really know how long lockdown was going to happen. So we had this aspect of people stockpiling. There were also severe shortages of agricultural people to lift foods and harvest the crops. And that again was a real problem for us. Farm labour was impacted terribly, and that was in part due to travel restrictions. Some workers had already returned home to their families because they were worried about Brexit and didn't know whether they would be able to work in this country. And others simply couldn't leave their home country to come over to gain work in the UK because their country was locked down. A government campaign was launched called Pick for Britain, and this was to rally the UK workforce to prevent lost crops in the fields. This, of course, was about perishable items, but of course these also too are items that we want to buy frequently, and it's important that we get them out of the field and into the supermarket so that we can eat them. Some small businesses were too small to survive, and you will all have heard stories in the initial lockdown period about businesses that had to close and didn't survive, which is very sad. This, of course, put pressure on larger businesses to increase capacity, if at all possible. And that is true in the retail sector and in the hospitality sector, where we were moving around supply from one area to another. We also learned in the early stages that this virus favours cold conditions, which is why it's no surprise that as we enter into winter, the worries that came with the early wave one are back now for wave two, and people are talking about what is going to happen as we now go through the winter months. Factories that work in cold chill chains, I'm talking about things where you might make ready meals, things like that. We had people within the workforce that contracted the virus and had to be quarantined for obvious reasons. This presented very real problems for running factories. Some factories inevitably had to reduce output, and with less than full-scale operation and productions, many factories went on to perhaps 3 days a week or partial lockdown. Most factories generally run 24/7 to keep the nation fed, and of course without that there was going to be some limitations of the foods that could be provided. Finally, on transportation, we're a global food industry taking foods from all over the world. Italy closed its borders, and with it the supply of tinned tomatoes and tomato puree, because that's where most of our tinned tomatoes come from. Germany and Holland has many food production sites, including those which manufacture gluten-free foods. And these countries were impacted much earlier on in COVID. If you remember, we were late getting the COVID in this country. And of course, those countries were already locked down, their borders were closed, and we could not move the raw material as they were held in ports and in the factories where they had been produced. So although there was supply, we couldn't move it. We could not get it across to us. So I want to look now at the next question, which is why these changes have happened. Without a doubt, everybody's behaviour's changed. Here am I talking to you from a screen, trying to present slides, perhaps not very well, where normally we might be in a room where we're chatting away and we can see each other. So lockdown has resulted in homeschooling, home working, and with that, many, many more meals are being prepared from home and eaten from home. As allergy sufferers, you will probably have been one of the very key people who've actually know very well about cooking from scratch, because you've had to do that maybe for many years because you've not been able to buy foods and you feel safer cooking for foods from scratch. We know that consumers were cooking and baking more, and those that were on furlough with children at home were doing these activities because there's no way you could be schooling your children in full time and working full time as well. So what we were seeing is that people were cooking very much from scratch, and therefore these raw ingredients like flour and eggs became in greater demand. All those recipes that have never seen the light of day, myself included, that I'd promised to cook, now came out and were, you know, being tested in earnest. Some of them won't be made again, I can promise you. But, you know, what we saw was this return to home cooking. Pre-COVID, a third of all food that was consumed was outside the home, and you will know that. But with hospitality closed down, this became, you know, it just came to an abrupt halt. Nobody was eating out. Whilst initially there was no shortage of raw ingredients, the logistics of the food supply systems are set up to meet hospitality demands, which are one thing, and then retail demands in another way. In hospitality, food is delivered in bulk and comes in big sacks of flour, you know, trays of eggs. There is the information around allergens comes with it on a single sheet of paper, and that then has to be relayed. That, of course, is different to what happens when you move in a factory situation, where, of course, you are buying bulk, but then you use it and then you make a prepared product which has a full ingredients list. What we couldn't do, and why shortages appeared, is because we could not simply redistribute foods that was designed for hospitality into the retail sector. It doesn't sound difficult, but because of some of the logistical problems, and we were all in lockdown, it meant that food was there, but we couldn't get access to it, and therefore we continued to have some shortages and, of course, the logistical challenges. For each raw material, there will be a specification, a technical specification, and anybody who's heard me speak before will know that the technical specification is the single point of information where all of the information, particularly around allergens, is held. These specifications vary a lot. For example, a specification that is for a high-end product will have different quality of ingredients to something that may be a more everyday type food. So there's a difference between a lasagna that's made for every day and a lasagna that's made for an eating out experience. You might use different pasta sheets, you might use a different type of cheese, you might use a higher quality mince. That might not matter for allergies, but if you look at things like desserts, you know, on a top tier dessert, you might have something like ground hazelnuts, whereas on an everyday version, you might not. So this simple concept of substitution just simply would be too risky for the food industry to do. So although the say food was there, we simply could not move it around, and we wouldn't want to, because that would in some way impinge our quality assurance. And as you know, again, quality assurance and the whole checks and measures that go into making sure that food is as it is intended to be eaten, we cannot afford to take any chances with that. So there were shortages of specific foods on shelves. If we look at the bakery market, for example, some businesses successfully moved to online and home delivery very quickly. Others closed. The lockdown hit wholesale bakery goods and food to go very hard. No one was eating in sandwich shops anymore. I referred to the restriction of goods that were moved earlier on, and there was also a monumental decline in the amount of people commuting. And of course, with that, people that were used to eating on the go. The shift from a highly transient on-the-go market to a highly restricted market where people were in lockdown resulted in a £6 billion decline in 2020 for the bakery sector alone. However, the sector is resilient, and some small artisan bakers have seen significant growth. And I'm sure there'll be many of you that are listening in today will have returned to your high streets and have reported maybe an upturn in the fortune of shopping locally and supporting smaller outlets. Simply moving food from one sector to the other is not without its challenges. As we've said, moving food from what's designed for hospitality into retail is not straightforward. You would have no packaging, and that is where you, as customers, would generally read your ingredients list and allergy declarations. When you of course, you buy something in a supermarket, you see the information printed on the label, and you are able to see the allergens in bold. That, of course, is not the case when you're buying something in hospitality. So this moving and shifting between hospitality and retail, you know, a single set of ingredients just simply really wouldn't work. I suppose it would work for a non-allergic consumer. You just say, we can move the food, it's not a problem. But for an allergic consumer, that would raise, I think, many anxieties, and we wouldn't really want to do that. So the concept of asking and hashtag easy to ask is really important if you are getting home deliveries. So I want to look now at the impact for the allergic consumer. I've touched on some of what I believe are the anxieties that will have been raised by this. I think, as a group of a segment of society, I think that wave one was quite a stark, potentially bleak picture for some of you, because I know that you couldn't get access to the foods that you needed. The individuals, would stockpile, and of course your natural behaviour is to, if you know something's you can trust to eat it, you want to buy more of it and put it in the freezer. That's a natural, typical behaviour. Because the supply chains were disrupted through the UK and Europe and from overseas, we did experience empty shelves, and demand did outstrip the supply. So that while the supply was there, we couldn't move it. Some food production may have been moved to a different production line for some of the reasons that I talked about at the beginning, where we had restricted access in factories and people may have been off on quarantine. New recipes and allergy updates might have appeared on products that you would have traditionally bought, and then as you went through COVID, you started to see that these had different labels on. That was probably due to the fact that they were being produced on a different production line during the COVID period. This wasn't done to make life difficult for you, although it might seem like that. It was done for a real reason, and because there was not enough people, or in fact, we'd had to move factories to make sure that we had continued supply, and this factory handled nuts or other allergens, and therefore a warning would appear on pack, or occasionally when we didn't have time to move, amend the packaging on a shelf edge ticket. Of course, packaging stocks are held for about 3 months, but after that, we print them again, and of course the printers were closed too. So these were all knock-on effects of how we couldn't get information there. At the start of wave one, we were all subject to this mass panic buying. I'm going to use the example of toilet roll, not because it's funny, but of course everybody went out and bought toilet roll. For the purposes of this webinar, all toilet rolls are equal and they will do the job. Now, of course, that's not the case if you're buying food, and particularly not the case for you if you're suffering from an allergy. A cake is not a cake. Milk is not a dairy alternative. And a convenient meal is not convenient if you've got to then start reading the label again and start worrying about all of the things that may have changed as a result of lockdown. So this is a particularly worrying time, and the burden was even greater for you and your family, giving more concern on top of what was already a terrible situation for COVID. So I think the impact for an allergic customer was very, very big. The pandemic was new to us all, and one could argue that the government should have been clearer about who were in the vulnerable groups. It seemed to extend to older people, people with diabetes, people with cardiovascular disease and respiratory conditions. But it never really mentioned people with life-threatening allergies. The question I would ask is, did the government miss an opportunity to highlight this group as a vulnerable group in society? And I think we might want to come back and think about that. I'm going to move now to what the industry are doing to keep you safe. In the middle of COVID, we were approached by some charities and professional organisations, including Diabetes UK, Celiac UK and the British Dietetic Association. The specific ask from these organisations was focused on the availability of sugar-free alternatives for diabetics, gluten-free options to be placed on restricted sales. The latter we were able to do, but it was too late because, of course, all the gluten-free food had been bought up and sold and was sitting in people's cupboards. And so pasta had largely been taken off the shelves, and bread stocks too were depleted. I think this, began to be really clear that we were finding out, well, who was buying these products? And I want to come back to that later on. I think what was happening is that people that would have traditionally been buying regular pasta, couldn't get regular pasta, began to panic and bought gluten-free pasta or other types of pasta that actually they would never normally eat. And, I suspect if we looked in their cupboards, it might well still be there now. And of course, that meant it wasn't available for you, who desperately needs this product as a part of your mainstay essential cupboard ingredients. Of course, our job as retailers was to keep shoppers happy by the provision of foods to meet everybody's needs. As we enter wave 2 now, we have a greater understanding of what lockdown might entail, and we can respond accordingly. Last week, the retail industry began issuing new customer notices as we now go into this second wave of lockdown. And I'm just going to put up a couple of slides now. This is actually from Waitrose because I was shopping in there as you would expect. So these are shelf edge ticket signs that are in Waitrose now. So we're limiting gluten-free products to no more than 3 per person. We're not asking people to buy any more eggs than 2 boxes. Dried pasta again, that would be no more than 3 items, and tinned fruit no more than 4 items per person. We've put these up very early in the process now because we do believe that what we don't want is a repeat of that. And while supplies, in essence, and transportation is no longer in lockdown, what we don't really want to experience is empty shelves if we can at all get, make that possible. And therefore, it's important that we try and make sure that there is food for everybody, whatever your specific shopping needs are. This is just a general slide which we're asking people to be considerate. Buy only what you need, There is plenty of stock available now, so please help other customers by shopping fairly. I think we will begin to see these in other supermarkets, and I haven't been there. They may well already be up, so you may well have knowledge of that yourselves. But I think what we see now is, you know, that you can go into shops and you can buy food. So although we're facing a fairly big, hefty, you know, 6 months now of COVID, wave 2, I think we've all learned that we probably can be a bit more considerate in our shopping to make sure that there is everything to go round. I want to come back now to the final question, which is what the future might hold. As we enter wave 2 now, we're beginning to understand what the impact of lockdown means. We must hope that with greater awareness, we can shop more considerately, thinking of others. Think about when you're purchasing products. Is this a product that somebody who had a serious allergy would want to buy? And if so, do you need to buy it? If not, don't. The burden on the shopkeeper is difficult enough without adding the role of policing. You know, I'm sorry, madam, sir, you know, I've noticed you're purchasing these products. Have you got an allergy? You know, we don't want this to become a question and answer session. We simply are asking that people are considerate, and you will know yourself whether this product is suitable for you. Eating out may well take another dip, and I think what we've seen today and this week is that you know, outlets are being closed, they're being restricted on that, and they may well continue to be so as the winter month comes and as the virus continues to spread. With this, online home deliveries are booming. And as the winter comes, you know, I don't want to be queuing outside the supermarket. Of course, having food delivered to your home makes life much, much easier. But I was thinking just this week about all those young students who've gone to university for the first time, who are in halls, who are locked down, and there almost certainly will be people that have got allergies and intolerances and who will need special diets. How are they going to manage if the supermarkets don't have product, and if they're actually relying on takeaways being delivered to their halls of residence? These home deliveries, whether you're dialing, you know, whatever, you can dial anything now and get it delivered. I think what's important to remember is that we mustn't rely on the person that's delivering it, because they are simply a delivery driver. They may be picking food up from 3 or 4 different outlets for students who want different foods, whether it's a pizza or a, you know, a burger. So it's really, really critical for students, and some of you may have young people that have gone away to university now for the first time, that they continue to make sure that they are asking the right questions. I would say ask again, check again, and there's no room for complacency as we move that. And you know, the delivery man simply will not know the questions that you have to ask. I do raise this as I'm really concerned that these are the types of circumstances where things can go wrong, particularly with young people. We've got to weather another 6 months. All retailers, I think without exception now, have increased their capacity for online orders. This makes life easier for consumers. And although substitutions do happen, you know, check is what I would say. I think one key question that comes to mind is, for those with allergies, is, you know, should we be adding in people who've got severe allergies into that vulnerable list so that they too can get access either to early slots at supermarkets or indeed home deliveries that are specifically designed for people who've got severe food allergies? So I want to leave it there. Undoubtedly, there are some more changes to come. We need to adapt as a food system. We've done some of it, but there'll be more to come. We may need to redefine our priorities, but I think we will emerge stronger and more resilient. But I think the landscape of food and food production has changed, and you know, will probably have changed for the good and for a different type of, you know, responding to a pandemic of this scale. So thank you very much for that, and I'm going to hand back to Lynn now and see what questions we've got coming in.
Thank you very much, Moira. That was an excellent presentation, and as always, incredibly clear. Really informative, so thank you for that. We've had a number of questions which I'd like to ask you, and they sort of fit into the headings that you've been talking about, so I think that's helpful, but we've had an awful lot of interest. As I say, if we don't manage to get through all the questions, we'll address them after the meeting and put them on a Q&A on our website and get the link out to everybody. But we'll try and get through as many as we can. So the first question I'd like to ask you is one that we were sent before this presentation. I feel uncomfortable picking up and putting back something on the shelf when shopping, but it's critical for me to read the labels thoroughly. Do supermarket staff really understand how important this is to us?
I think that's interesting, actually. It's not just food, of course. If you're doing clothes shopping, book shopping, shopping in, you know, going to a library, or touching trolleys or baskets, you know, we're all sort of, you know, touching stuff as we go. That is why these, you know, the COVID guidelines around sanitizing your hands at front of store, you know, sanitizing the trolley as you go in or the basket, is part of it, because we do know that people will want to pick stuff up and have a look at it. They want to pick stuff up for a number of reasons, not just for allergies. Some people are concerned about nutrition information. If you're a diabetic, you might be looking at the amount of carbohydrate or sugar in the product. And therefore, you know, you might be looking at how to cook it if you've not got a microwave or something. So people pick products up for a whole range of stuff, and of course the staff have to keep replenishing the shelves as well. So I really see that the responsibility has to sit with us, and although I do understand why people feel uncomfortable, we can't put products on the shelves and say this has never been touched by anybody, because that's not what a supermarket's about. So I think it's really important that you know, just make sure that you've, you know, sanitize, and I have sanitizer in the car, you know, have it everywhere. I'm constantly doing it, because I do know that I've got to go into the supermarket and pick up products.
Thank you, Moira. And I think that's actually a special issue for the allergic population, who obviously have to read the ingredients on back of pack. And that's difficult enough to do anyway, yes, even without living in the sort of circumstances that we are. So thank you for that answer. That was really helpful. Another question that's come in is, I've noticed more changes than normal to recipes on my favourite products. Do manufacturers have to highlight changes to ingredients on the front of their packaging so that we can see at a glance what has changed?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. That is part of the regulations that I'm classing us together there in the Anaphylaxis campaign, you know, we're very clear about, is that allergies have to be very clearly indicated on front of pack. So this should always be flagged on the front of pack. If there's any changes, it should say new recipes or updated allergens, as I indicated in my talk, occasionally done by a shelf edge ticket, if the packaging cannot be updated for some reason. But yes, if there's any discrepancy at all between that information, you must raise it with either the retailer, or if it's a branded goods, then directly with the manufacturer. So, you know, use the back of the pack, contact the customer care number and make sure that you go back. You know, that point that I made earlier on about being one technical specification, that is where the central point of information comes from. That is it. That is the gold standard. So anything that hasn't transferred across, and some of this is done digitally, you know, through the ether, if there's a discrepancy, then you know, please raise it. But you know, if there's been any changes, then it must clearly appear on the pack.
Thank you, Moira. And at the anaphylaxis campaign, we'd be very interested to hear from people if they are having experiences where these sorts of things are not highlighted, because we're very happy to have a conversation with the retailer on behalf of the individual consumer. Because if an individual has picked this up, there will be several who have picked this up, and we're more than happy to advocate for the consumer with the retailers on their behalf. So thank you for that very, very clear answer. The questions are coming thick and fast, Moira.
Okay, well, let's carry on if we happy to do that.
The next one. I've been shopping more online because of COVID, and sometimes the may contain information is not listed online, and I can't eat the food when it arrives because it may contain to my allergen. Shouldn't the labelling be the same online as on pack?
Yes, it absolutely should be, and that was the point that I made before when we were talking about ingredients. Is it should mirror there should be the technical specification is the single point of information. So if there's any anomalies with that, then you must raise that with somebody. It does happen because it all happens digitally, and here we are, you know, I've just had a hiccup with my laptop, you know, going off on back. These things do happen. So you know, it's your diligence to, you know, and reading labels and saying there's an anomaly here. This isn't right. I bought it thinking it's one thing and it's saying something else. So please raise these with us, and then they can be put right.
And again, I'd make the same point, Moira. If people are uncomfortable or don't quite know how to contact the right people, the technical people within the retailers or manufacturers, do ring our helpline at the anaphylaxis campaign, and we will take that issue up for you as individuals. Because, as I say, these things don't just only impact on one person, they impact on very many people who are trying to purchase food online.
Yeah.
The next one is about a specific product, but it's a product that I know is incredibly popular with so many people. And I'm so disappointed that Magnum ice creams have now added a may contain nuts warning. There are now no ice creams left that are safe for me to eat. Why do manufacturers have to change recipes or production methods? Is it because of COVID-19?
Well, I haven't had any Magnums, and I can see why you would be disappointed. I'm going to make a guess here. I think this will be a result of the factories having reduced staffing. Do you remember I talked about that? And therefore only able to operate 1 or 2 production lines. So they probably have moved the Magnum that was previously suitable for you to eat onto a line that perhaps cannot, that has had nuts on it, and therefore they've now had to add that warning to it. It might be that they've had to reduce to maybe running 1 or 2 production lines. It may be that they've moved the production to a different site completely because of, for whatever reason. So it will be to do with the factory process. That's my best answer at this, I would say. Whether or not they'll be able to bring it back to a nut-free site, you know, in the future, I suppose really you should write to Magnum and ask them about whether or not that could be the case. But it may well be as a result of COVID, definitely.
Yes, I mean, having visited various food factories over the past few years and not having worked in the food industry before at all, and not had such contact with it before joining the anaphylaxis campaign. The complexity of producing food is unbelievable, and really it's very hard for the consumers to understand that complexity. So when issues do arise, but particularly specific issues like the one that's just been mentioned about the ice cream, it is worthwhile talking to the retailer or the manufacturer and just getting some understanding of why it is that this particular issue may have occurred. And as I say again, we're always in conversation with retailers and manufacturers to sort of unpick that sort of issue. I'm going to ask one last question, Moira. I think we can squeeze one more in. Questions are still coming in. Okay. So as I say, we will send those on later, and we will address those on our Q&A on the website. But I'll make this the final one. I have noticed that the free-from sections of supermarkets rarely contain products which are free from both nuts and soya. In fact, mostly they can contain products where the dairy, egg or gluten element has been replaced by nuts and or soya. As my daughter is allergic to both, this is frustrating. Is there any reason why there are so few products that meet our needs?
Oh dear, yes, that's a terrible combination of allergies to have, unfortunately. Yeah. I suppose really production sites handle mostly all raw ingredients. Of course, sometimes we do have, factories that don't contain the raw ingredient that we talk about, whether it's soya or nuts. But I'm just thinking something like ground nuts, because it's high in fat, acts as a really good substitute for things like eggs or dairy products where you need something to bind a product together. I also think that making products which would be free of nuts and soya, if you've made them at home, and I'm sure you had, whoever's asked this question, they've got a very short shelf life. And, whilst they might be fine for you when you've eaten them at home for 1 or 2 days, they wouldn't stand what would essentially be, the transportation, the storage, the getting them onto the shelf and possibly sitting there for a week. They just wouldn't be the same quality. And I suppose that's really what stops people in production of these types of products, is that they probably wouldn't really be of a quality that people want to sell, and therefore when you make them at home, you eat them fresh and ready prepared. So I suppose it's to do with this whole thing about being able to replicate the home eating experience, but with a reasonable shelf life, and those two are probably at odds with each other, which is why we end up with this nuts being used in opposed to egg, or that type of substitution of ingredients. There's only so many substitutions that you can make that give a good tasting product. So it's not my area of expertise, but that would be my suggestion, that it's probably to do with the fact that it would not stand the rigors of shelf life, and you'd end up with something that was probably not very good at the end of it, not because it can't be done, but because it just wouldn't produce a good product that would sit on the shelf for enough time. So I'm afraid that leaves you with a bit more home baking, whoever asked that question. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much, Moira. Our time is almost up. I have to say a huge thank you to you for giving this brilliant presentation and answering the questions so clearly. We're really very grateful to you. There will be a Q&A on our website, www.anaphylaxis.org.uk. We also have a special section on COVID-19, www.anaphylaxis.org.uk/COVID/19/advice. So there is a special section there. And please, please, everybody, do call our helpline. If our advisor, if my helpline advisors don't know the answer, they know an expert like Moira, who is always happy for us to refer issues to her and to other members of our corporate panel and to get answers for you. And we are very happy to speak to retailers and manufacturers on your behalf. So thank you all for being part of this webinar, and I hope you join us for the next one in the series. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.